Thomas Hobbes begins with one of the darkest assumptions in the history of philosophy. While many philosophers ask how human beings can become wise, virtuous, or fulfilled, Hobbes starts with a more unsettling question. What are people like before civilization forces them to behave? Strip away laws, governments, courts, police, traditions, and social order. What remains? His answer is famously bleak. Competition, fear, distrust, conflict. According to Hobbes, human beings are not naturally harmonious creatures waiting to cooperate peacefully. They are self-interested, vulnerable, and constantly aware that others can threaten their survival. In a world without authority, nobody can ever feel secure because even the strongest person can be killed while sleeping, poisoned by a weaker rival, or overwhelmed by a group. This leads Hobbes to one of the most famous ideas in political philosophy, the state of nature. The state of nature is not necessarily a historical period. It is a thought experiment. Hobbes asks us to imagine what life would be like if there were no common authority capable of enforcing rules. Without a power strong enough to keep order, individuals become trapped in mutual suspicion. Even if people would prefer peace, they cannot trust others enough to lower their guard. The result is a world where fear becomes rational. You do not attack because you enjoy violence. You attack because you fear being attacked first. You do not distrust others because you are evil. You distrust them because trust can get you killed. The logic becomes self-reinforcing. Every person knows that everyone else is operating under the same conditions. From this emerges Hobbes's famous description of life in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is one of the most powerful images in political thought because it captures a genuine insight. Cooperation is fragile. Social order is not automatic. Peace often depends on institutions that people take for granted. When those institutions collapse, conflict can emerge surprisingly fast. History contains enough civil wars, state failures, and violent breakdowns to make Hobbes's warning difficult to dismiss entirely. This is why intelligent people continue taking Hobbes seriously. He forces us to appreciate how much of everyday life depends on trust, stability, and enforcement. Civilization is not merely a collection of conveniences. It is a structure preventing countless conflicts that would otherwise emerge. Hobbes sees something many idealists ignore. Peace is not self-sustaining. That insight remains valuable. The problem begins when Hobbes turns a partial truth into a complete picture of human nature. Because human beings are not only capable of conflict, they are also capable of cooperation. Long before modern states existed, people formed families, tribes, communities, religious groups, trading networks, and systems of mutual support. Human beings survived not only because they competed, but because they collaborated. Language itself is cooperative. Culture is cooperative. Raising children is cooperative. Knowledge is cooperative. If people were as fundamentally distrustful as Hobbes suggests, much of human history becomes difficult to explain. Why help strangers? Why sacrifice for family? Why care about reputation? Why feel guilt? Why experience loyalty? Why create moral systems that condemn purely self-interested behavior? Hobbes tends to reinterpret these phenomena through self-interest. Cooperation exists because it ultimately benefits the individual. Morality exists because it promotes stability. Even generosity can often be explained strategically. Sometimes this explanation works, but sometimes it feels too narrow. Because people frequently act against immediate self-interest. They risk themselves for others. They remain loyal when betrayal would be profitable. They keep promises that nobody can enforce. They perform acts of courage with no guarantee of reward. These behaviors are not rare exceptions scattered throughout history. They are part of ordinary human life. This is where Hobbes begins to feel psychologically incomplete. His view captures one side of human nature brilliantly: fear, competition, insecurity, self-preservation. But human beings are not driven only by fear. They are also driven by affection, belonging, curiosity, love, duty, friendship, admiration, and shared purpose. A philosophy that treats these primarily as extensions of self-interest risks, reducing human complexity to a single emotional foundation. And once that reduction happens, the entire picture of humanity starts becoming darker than reality itself. Hobbes sees human beings at their worst and assumes he has discovered their deepest truth. But the fact that people can become selfish under pressure does not necessarily mean selfishness is their most fundamental characteristic. That assumption is where his philosophy becomes much more controversial than many people realize. The deeper weakness in Hobbes appears when we look at what his philosophy assumes about trust itself. Hobbes treats trust as something fragile that only emerges when a powerful authority makes cooperation safer than conflict. In other words, people do not trust because they are naturally inclined toward one another. They trust because the consequences of breaking trust become too costly. This is a remarkably influential idea. Modern political systems are built partly on the assumption that incentives matter more than virtue. Contracts work because they can be enforced. Laws work because violations are punished. Governments maintain order because they possess the power to compel obedience. Hobbes wants political stability to rest on realistic assumptions rather than optimistic hopes about human goodness. There is genuine wisdom in this. History repeatedly shows that societies cannot rely solely on good intentions. Institutions matter. Rules matter. Enforcement matters. A civilization that assumes everyone will behave nobly without accountability usually discovers otherwise. Hobbes understands the darker possibilities of human behavior with unusual clarity. But there is a subtle shift in his philosophy that creates a much larger problem. He begins by observing that people are capable of selfishness. Then he gradually starts explaining human behavior as though selfishness is the primary reality beneath everything else. That move seems small at first, but it changes the entire picture of humanity. Because once self-interest becomes the central explanatory principle, every higher motivation starts looking suspicious. Love becomes strategic attachment. Loyalty becomes long-term self-interest. Morality becomes social convenience. Altruism becomes hidden calculation. The richer dimensions of human life are reduced to survival and advantage. This is where Hobbes starts sounding less realistic and more cynical. After all, human beings do not merely seek safety. They seek meaning. People routinely pursue goals that expose them to danger rather than protecting them from it. Explorers cross oceans. Scientists devote decades to difficult problems. Parents sacrifice for children. Soldiers risk death for causes. Activists endure imprisonment. Artists endure poverty to create work they believe matters. These actions are not easy to explain through fear and self-preservation alone. Something else is operating. Human beings appear motivated not only by what protects them, but also by what transcends them. Hobbes struggles with this dimension of human nature because his philosophy is built from the ground up on vulnerability and insecurity. He sees the fear of death as the most fundamental political fact, and certainly fear matters. A person who does not care about survival cannot participate in society for long. But survival is not the highest value for many people. History is full of individuals who willingly sacrifice safety for principle, truth, faith, honor, or love. They did not do so because they miscalculated their interests. They did so because some values felt more important than survival itself. This creates a challenge for Hobbes's entire framework. If people care about things beyond self-preservation, then political order cannot be understood solely through fear. Fear may establish stability, but it cannot fully explain what makes life worth stabilizing in the first place. There is also a psychological issue hidden inside Hobbes's view of authority. If people are naturally dangerous to one another, then society requires a powerful sovereign capable of maintaining peace. Hobbes famously argues that citizens should surrender significant freedom in exchange for security. Better a strong ruler than a return to chaos. Again, there is wisdom here. Civil conflict is often worse than imperfect government. A flawed authority may still be preferable to violent disorder. Many societies throughout history have learned this lesson painfully. But Hobbes pushes this logic very far. Once security becomes the supreme political value, freedom begins losing its importance. Dissent becomes risky. Individual autonomy becomes secondary. The citizen increasingly exists to preserve stability rather than pursue higher aspirations. This creates a troubling trade-off. A society can become so focused on avoiding conflict that it forgets why freedom matters at all. Fear is effective at creating order. It is much less effective at creating flourishing. People do not merely want protection. They want dignity. They want purpose. They want opportunities to think, create, disagree, and pursue lives they find meaningful. Hobbes often treats these desires as secondary compared to the fundamental need for security. But human beings rarely experience them as secondary. In fact, many political struggles throughout history emerged precisely because people were willing to risk security in order to gain freedom. That is something Hobbes never fully captures. He understands why people fear one another. He understands why societies need order. He understands why institutions matter. What he struggles to explain is why human beings repeatedly reach beyond safety itself, pursuing ideals that cannot be reduced to survival and sometimes directly contradicted. And once you recognize that, Hobbes's picture of humanity begins to look incomplete. Not because he is entirely wrong, but because he mistakes one powerful truth about human nature for the whole truth. The final limitation of Hobbes is that he mistakes a defensive theory of human beings for a complete theory of human beings. He sees something real and important. People can be selfish, fearful, competitive, and dangerous. History provides overwhelming evidence for that. Wars happen, betrayals happen, communities collapse. Violence emerges when trust breaks down. Hobbes deserves credit for refusing to build political philosophy on unrealistic optimism. The problem is not that he sees darkness. The problem is that he treats darkness as the foundation of everything else. For Hobbes, fear is the starting point. The fear of death, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of other people. Society exists because individuals want protection from one another. Government exists because human beings cannot reliably trust one another without an authority powerful enough to enforce peace. That logic is internally consistent, but it raises an uncomfortable question. If fear is truly the deepest reality of human nature, why do human beings spend so much of their lives pursuing things that fear alone cannot explain? People fall in love knowing they can be hurt. They have children knowing they will worry constantly. They devote themselves to causes that may fail. They risk their reputations for truth. They sacrifice comfort for purpose. They create art, pursue knowledge, and search for meaning in ways that often make life harder rather than safer. A creature driven primarily by self-preservation should behave very differently. Yet human history is filled with people who repeatedly choose significance over security. This is where Hobbes begins to underestimate the human spirit, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Human beings are not simply survival machines. They are meaning-making creatures. They want to belong to something larger than themselves. They want identities, loyalties, ideals, and purposes that justify the risks of living. Safety matters enormously, but it is rarely enough by itself. You can see this even in modern societies. Many people live in the safest conditions in human history, yet they remain restless. They search for meaning, community, purpose, achievement, and connection. Their greatest problems are often not physical threats, but existential ones. They do not ask only how to survive. They ask why survival matters. Hobbes has surprisingly little to say about that question. His philosophy excels at explaining how order emerges from fear. It struggles to explain how flourishing emerges from meaning. And that distinction matters. A society can be stable without being inspiring. A society can be orderly without being fulfilling. A society can protect life without giving people reasons to value it. Hobbes often treats peace as the ultimate achievement because he understands how terrible chaos can become. But human beings do not merely want the absence of conflict. They want lives worth living once conflict has been avoided. This becomes especially important when we look at his political conclusions. Because if human beings are fundamentally dangerous, then strong authority becomes the solution. The more pessimistic your view of human nature, the more power you tend to give institutions to manage it. Hobbes's famous Leviathan is built on exactly this principle. Citizens surrender significant freedom in exchange for protection. There is wisdom in that bargain, but there is also risk, because governments are made of the same human beings Hobbes distrusts in the first place. If ordinary people are selfish and power-seeking, why assume rulers will be different? The philosophy that begins with suspicion toward humanity often ends by concentrating enormous power in human hands. That tension never fully disappears. Hobbes fears chaos so much that he sometimes underestimates the dangers of authority itself. Yet history shows that power can become oppressive just as easily as disorder can become violent. The problem is not merely human selfishness. The problem is human selfishness everywhere, including among those who govern. This is why later thinkers challenge Hobbes so strongly. They accepted that people are imperfect, but rejected the idea that fear should be the primary foundation of political life. They argued that cooperation, trust, civic virtue, and shared values are not merely secondary additions to society. They are part of what makes society possible in the first place. And perhaps that is the deepest criticism of Hobbes. He looks at humanity during its worst moments and assumes he has discovered its essential nature. But people are not only what they become under fear, they're also what they become under love. They are not only capable of violence, they're capable of sacrifice. They're not only driven by insecurity, they are driven by meaning. Hobbes understood something profoundly important about why civilization exists. His warning about conflict remains one of the most influential ideas in political philosophy. But he built his entire vision of humanity around a single emotion: fear. And once fear becomes the foundation of everything, the richer dimensions of human life start fading into the background. That is why Hobbes's philosophy feels simultaneously realistic and incomplete. He understood why human beings need order, but he never fully understood why human beings seek something greater than safety once they have it. And that is why his view of humanity often feels less like a complete picture of the human condition and more like a portrait painted from its darkest corner.